The rain hammered against the hospital window like 1,000 tiny fists, each drop a reminder of every prayer that had gone unanswered, every hope that had slipped through desperate fingers. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the view of the parking lot below, where her rusted Toyota sat alone under a flickering streetlight. Inside her coat pocket, her phone buzzed for the 14th time that hour. Bill. Collectors didn't take nights off, didn't care that her daughter was 3 floors up fighting for every breath, didn't understand that sometimes a mother has to choose between electricity and insulin, between rent and the medication that keeps a 7-year-old heart beating. She had been so sure she could handle it alone. 3 years since David walked out. 3 years of double shifts at the diner and weekend cleaning jobs. 3 years of telling Mia that everything would be okay even when the eviction notices piled up like autumn leaves. She'd gotten good at smiling through the fear, at making mac and cheese seem like a feast, at pretending that worn-out shoes were just as good as new ones. But you can't smile your way through type 1 diabetes. You can't pretend when your child's body is shutting down because you had to choose between her insulin and keeping a roof over her head. The nurse had been kind when they admitted Mia to the ICU. Too kind. That's how Sarah knew it was bad. "We'll do everything we can," she'd said, squeezing Sarah's shoulder with a practiced gentleness that spoke of too many conversations like this one. The doctor had been more direct, without the specialized treatment, without the medication Mia needed. They were looking at days, maybe a week. And the cost? Sarah had actually laughed when he told her. Not because it was funny, but because the number was so impossibly large it belonged to a different universe, one where people had savings, accounts and insurance that actually covered things, and families who could help. She had no family, no backup plan, no miracle waiting in the wings. The cafeteria coffee tasted like regret and burned plastic. But Sarah drank it anyway because it was something to do with her hands. Some small action in a world that had become utterly still. She sat in the corner booth, the one with the ripped vinyl, seat that nobody else wanted, and pulled out her phone. The fundraising page she'd created 3 days ago stared back at her. 247s raised of a $180,000 goal, most of it from other single mothers at the diner, women who could barely afford to give $10 but did anyway because they understood, because it could just as easily be their kid upstairs. "Excuse me?" Sarah looked up to find a woman standing beside her table. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the kind of face that had seen both, laughter and loss. She wore jeans and a cardigan that had definitely seen better days, and carried a purse that looked older than Mia. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said softly. "I'm Margaret. I volunteer here sometimes, and I couldn't help but overhear you talking to the billing office earlier." Sarah's cheeks burned. Of course someone had heard her begging, pleading for a payment plan for anything. "I'm handling it," she said automatically. The lie so practiced it almost sounded true. Margaret slid into the booth across from her without asking. "My daughter died in this hospital 23 years ago. She was 8, leukemia." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and honest. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. "I was a lot like you," Margaret continued, her eyes distant. "Broke, alone, terrified. I worked 3 jobs trying to pay for her treatment, and it still wasn't enough. Back then, they didn't have the medicine they have now. If they had—" She trailed off, then seemed to shake herself. "Anyway, that's not why I'm telling you this." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. The kind that gets reused until it's more tape than paper. Inside was a check. Sarah glanced at it, then did a double-take that nearly gave her whiplash. That's... "It's everything," Margaret said simply. "My savings. The life insurance money from my husband, he passed 6 years ago. The money from selling our house. I've been living in a small apartment, working part-time at the library, trying to figure out what to do with it all. And then I heard you today, and I knew. I can't take this." Sarah pushed the envelope back across the table, even as her hands shook with the desire to grab it and run straight to the billing office. "This is your life, your security." "My daughter was my life," Margaret said, and her voice cracked just slightly. "And I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save yours." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Years of holding everything together finally breaking apart. "Why?" Sarah managed to choke out. "You don't even know us." Margaret reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in hers. They were warm and papery and steady. "Because someone should have done it for me. Because your little girl deserves a chance. Because kindness doesn't need a reason. It just needs to happen." The next hours blurred together in a watercolor of disbelief and desperate hope. The billing office, initially skeptical, slowly transformed their expressions from professional sympathy to genuine surprise as the check cleared. The doctor pulled from his rounds, confirming that yes, they could begin the treatment immediately. The nurses, moving with renewed purpose, preparing Mia's IV lines, while Sarah stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, watching the rise and fall of that small chest under the hospital blanket. But it was what happened next that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Margaret didn't leave. She sat with Sarah through that first endless night as the medication began its work. She brought real food from somewhere, not hospital cafeteria sadness, but actual sandwiches from a deli down the street. She didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances or platitudes about God's plan or everything happening for a reason. She just sat there, a quiet presence in the storm, occasionally squeezing Sarah's hand when the monitors beeped in ways that made her heart stop. Around 3 a.m., Mia's fever broke. The doctor called it a good sign. Sarah called it a miracle, even though Margaret insisted it was just medicine and Margaret's money and timing. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as dawn began painting the sky outside in shades of pink and gold. "I mean, you gave me everything. How will you—" "I'll figure it out," Margaret said with a small smile. "I always do. And honestly, for the first time since I lost my Emma, I feel like the money meant something. Like she meant something. Like maybe I finally did the thing I was supposed to do." Mia woke up around 7, groggy, confused but alive, so beautifully, impossibly alive. Sarah held her daughter's hand and told her everything would be okay. And this time it wasn't a lie. Margaret stood to leave, gathering her ancient purse and that ratty cardigan. Sarah caught her at the door. "I'll pay you back," she promised. "I don't know how, I don't know when, but I swear—" "Don't pay me back," Margaret interrupted gently. "Pay it forward. Someday, when you can, when you see someone else drowning, throw them a rope. That's all I ask." She left before Sarah could argue, disappearing into the morning shift change, just another volunteer in a hospital full of small miracles and quiet heroes. 3 weeks later, Mia came home. The treatment was working. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Sarah went back to work, but something had shifted inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, about the impossible gift, about what it meant to be saved by a stranger's kindness. She started small. A donation to another mother's fundraiser, a few extra hours at the community center, serving meals to families who looked like she had felt, exhausted, desperate, barely hanging on. She told Mia about Margaret, about how sometimes angels don't have wings. They just have warm hands and worn cardigans and the courage to give everything away. "Will I meet her again?" Mia asked one night. Curled up on the couch under the blanket Margaret had left behind. A gesture so small, Sarah hadn't even noticed until they were packing up to leave the hospital. "Maybe," Sarah said. "Or maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to be her for someone else." Years would pass. Mia would grow strong and healthy, would learn to manage her diabetes, would eventually become a doctor herself, drawn to pediatric oncology because of a woman named Emma she'd never met. Sarah would rebuild her life, would find stability, would never forget the night she learned that humanity's greatest power isn't in its wealth or strength, but in its capacity to look at a stranger's suffering and say, "Not on my watch." And Margaret? She found a smaller apartment, picked up extra shifts at the library, lived simply and without regret. She kept a photo of Emma on her nightstand, and sometimes, when she passed the hospital on her bus route home, she'd smile and think about a little girl named Mia who got to grow up, who got to have all the tomorrows that Emma never did. The ripple effects of a single act of kindness are impossible to measure. They spread outward like rings in water, touching lives in ways we'll never know, in places we'll never see. Margaret titled that chapter of her life Her, for Emma, for Mia, for every daughter who deserves a fighting chance. And in doing so, she proved that Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply choose to love beyond our own pain, to give beyond our own need, to be the miracle someone else is praying for. Because in the end, we're all just walking each other home. And sometimes that journey requires us to carry someone for a while. Not because we have to, not because we'll get something in return, but because it's what makes us human. Because it's what makes us whole.